بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. المقدمة الثانية المفهوم. So, last session we finished with discussing hikmah and its divisions. We mentioned the divisions of practical philosophy, the divisions of theoretical philosophy, namely with regards to theoretical philosophy, metaphysics, natural philosophy, and mathematics. About mathematics, right, we clarified that mathematics, and this is something you guys raised some questions about after too, that mathematics is subject, although it depends on matter in the mind too, it doesn't, unlike natural philosophy, depend on a specific kind of matter, right? Insofar as we're talking about mathematics, right? So mathematical objects depend on matter to exist, like natural objects. However, unlike them, they don't depend on matter on a specific matter in the mind. They depend on a kind of general or vague or intelligible matter, right? And apart from this, they are not strictly speaking objects of mathematics, right? Is that a fair characterization of what we spoke about last time?
That is fair, but if I just may ask a very quick
question. Yeah, please go ahead.
So we were talking. So the brother Hassan and I were discussing in the chat a few days ago, and I think he was asking regarding whether or not, like, mathematical entities, and that like are, so like when you said with regards to intellection of the numbers, right?
Yeah.
And is it what's the substrate? Is it going to be general matter or specific matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that the estimative faculty is substrate would be the estimate would be the specific matter, right? Mm. Is that right? I just wanted to make sure because I wasn't sure if that was right there. Is it the specific matter that is in the mind when you basically do estimation of a number, right? So if I see, for example, a triangle, right? The shape of the triangle that I estimate, right, that I cognize via the estimative faculty, is of that particular triangle, right? Is that right? I just wanted to make sure, because then I'm trying to understand what do we mean by the general matter then?
You mean of the particular? You mean with the particular, let's say, matter? It is outside the mind. Let's say if it's, a triangle in like some wood.
Yes. Let's say the form of the triangle in some wood, right?
Yeah.
That is it inheres in that material object. But when I have the shape of that wood in my mind, I have it via the estimation faculty, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and that I have that shape that belongs to that particular matter. So the substrate, right, would be specific matter, right? Mm-hmm. Am I misunderstanding this? Because I'm trying to understand the role of general matter. Like when you say that you have a shape in your mind, right? What does it belong to? Is it regarding? Like, does it have to be that particular shape? Right? Well, a particular one or a general shape?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to belong to any specific matter. It's general in the sense of it's just sort of extension in general, right? Quantity in general, but you don't need to think of, let's say, the wood or whatever else the material substrate might be when you think of that mathematical object, right? But you are still thinking of a kind of like extended quantitative something.
Yeah, because Anthony says, I thought estimation of mathematical realities is always linked to cognition with specific matter. Yeah. Intellection of mathematical realities is linked to general vague matter, right? And I respond, I think estimation of mathematical entities is linked to general matter. That's what I thought, which I think was wrong because you put the thumbs up to his comment. So I was kind of confused there. I thought that when we estimate a mathematical entity,
Yeah.
right, that estimation is regarding, so it is regarding that specific matter. But then when you say intellection, so when Essam says intellection of mathematical realities, is he talking about what a number is devoid of matter and its concomitants? Because that can't be linked to general matter because the form dispenses away with all the things that have to do with matter, right?
Yeah. I think I mean, regarding estimation, right? Like the objects of estimation are always linked with some sensible content.
Yes,
Okay.
that's understood. Yeah.
Right. So the estimation doesn't, it perceives the non-sensible thing linked with the sensible thing.
Yes.
Right.
Like the fear, the danger in the wolf.
Yeah. Or you could say the shape of the object, of the wooden object, right? The triangular shape of the wooden object, right?
Yeah.
So I think insofar as that's the case, then estimation, cognition is always, of the mathematical object, is always connected to like some sensible thing that it finds it with, or that it associates it with, right?
Yeah,
based
that
on
particular object, that sensible object.
Like it could be the wood, it could be the chalk, it could be the steel, it could be whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I think that is specific matter, right?
Yeah.
But at the level of intellection, it need not do that.
Okay, so
right, but
that's good. When you think intellection, you mean when the form is impressed on the intellect by the active intellect, right?
Yeah. Or when, and especially though when you're subjecting the mathematical object to mathematical operations.
Okay, but so if that's the case, right, then why at that level is it still linked to general matter? Because I thought the Sheikh says that at that level it's purely immaterial, right? And so he gives them, that's why he says that the immaterial has to be that the intellect has to be immaterial, and because the form that's impressed upon it is completely devoid of like matter and its concomitants. So here I see that the mathematical reality is linked to general matter. I guess that's what's kind of confusing me. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I think it's a good question. So I think all objects, whether it's natural objects, mathematical or metaphysical, insofar as they're objects of the intellect, right? They're all immaterial in the sense that they lack the spatio-temporal properties that material things have, right? They lack the matter that is outside the mind, and they lack the concomitants that are associated with that matter.
But wouldn't it?
So even like the form of human. Sorry.
Like, isn't it itself a concomitant though? Right, like number or shape is a concomitant of matter, right?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand its role. Sorry, look, if you wanted to discuss this after, I don't want to take.
No, I think it's good. It's good. It's worth clarifying. And I actually have a passage here by Zaripur, which might be helpful.
Yeah, because I'm trying to understand how the intellection of the mathematical reality, right? And I'm trying to understand how we can coherently say that it's linked to general matter. Because my understanding is that when the forms are impressed upon the intellect, the forms are completely devoid of matter and its concomitants. So the mathematical reality, whatever it is, would have to be devoid of that, right? But we're saying that it's linked to general matter. So that's kind of like what I'm maybe seeing a problem. But it might not be.
No, I see what you're saying. I think it's a good question, and I think there are different senses of matter involved here, right? So, I mean, what you say about mathematical objects, insofar as they're in the intellect, and insofar as anything in the intellect is immaterial, I think that also applies to like objects of natural philosophy too, right? So like humanity, right, in the intellect is purely abstract.
Yeah.
It's devoid of matter and the concomitants of matter.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's right.
So that's true for all of them.
Yeah, exactly.
Right,
I'm
but
trying to understand why we're saying that it's linked to general matter for mathematical realities.
yeah, I think it's in the sense that not insofar as you just simply conceptualize, let's say, what quantity is or what, let's say, shape is, right, in itself, as opposed to, let's say, some particular shape that's associated with like various features, particular features, say here, this long, at this time, and so on, right? But not insofar as you just cognize that apart from all of those things, which would be the abstract concept of shape, right?
Yeah.
But insofar as you subject it to various mental operations that are sort of typical of mathematical studies. So as subject to mathematical studies, the shape or the figure or the number is associated with some matter, even in the mind, because you can't like add, divide, and so on and so forth without some sort of conception of some kind of quantitative subject.
So would it be fair to say then, if that's the case, then at the level of mathematical operations, we aren't, properly speaking, intellecting the realities of mathematical objects, right? Because, do you see what I'm saying though? Because if we want to say that it has to be devoid of matter and concomitants, then we have to know what that number is in and of itself, devoid of those things, right? But I feel like if we're saying that from the sense of mathematical operations, yeah, go ahead.
I think it would be better to say, when you're just conceptualizing, let's say, a number or a shape, you're not necessarily doing mathematics, right? But when you're conceptualizing a shape with a view to, let's say, adding
some kind of
describing or dividing and so on and so forth, with a view to that sort of thing, you are doing mathematics.
Yeah. So when I say that we're not technically, properly speaking, intellecting in this case, I just mean that trying to conceptualize its essence devoid of operation.
Yeah, we're not just doing that.
Okay, yeah.
Right?
Because what I understand is like when I intellect the irrational animality, I understand the essence of human devoid of matter and its concomitants. And if I do that for a mathematical object, it would have to be devoid of general matter, right?
Yeah. Okay, I mean, it's just purely material, yeah. But when you're doing mathematics, you're also conceptualizing. But you're not just conceptualizing. You're also doing other things, and that involves the conception of, that involves the association of the mathematical object with vague matter or general matter.
Yeah.
Right? So you can't be doing mathematics without conceptualizing, properly speaking, but you can conceptualize without doing mathematics.
Yes, I see.
Right?
Yeah. So I have to think about that one.
Yeah, so it's really just about this, like these notions as they are subject to mathematical studies. Like, what the Sheikh says about numbers, right? Numbers is a bit more complicated, he says, because numbers can apply to immaterial things, right? But he thinks that that's not the mathematical study of number. That's a metaphysical study, right?
Yeah.
So numbers, unlike shapes, have this you could say ontological independence, right? Yeah. They only have this epistemic dependence on matter or vague matter.
Okay. But you would agree with me when I say that we could consider these numbers or shapes in and of themselves as being essences that are devoid of matter, whether it's general or specific, in its concomitants, right? Like that's accurate to say. Just like we can say that with regards to any other essence, right? So they do have these realities in and of themselves. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, like you mean devoid of all the concomitants that they are found with, material concomitants that they're found outside the mind?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, and you're saying we can conceptualize, like, let's say, triangularity purely in the abstract, right?
Yeah, so it would be a three-sided polygon,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. I think that's right. I think that's right.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
that that's not mathematics,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
As such, that's not
But what I understood is that the proper understanding of intellection, like the way I've read so far from the Sheikh, is to think about the triangle in that sense, the three-sided polygon, and not something that's still related to general matter. That's kind of what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
I think that's right. That's proper intellection, but
Yeah.
but that's not the object of mathematics.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, no,
Even though
now,
in the when as an object of mathematics, you also you also have that proper intellection too. It's just you have something more as well when you submit it to mathematical operations.
I see.
So if you look at here, in connection with that, what? Hold on. No, not this. Wait.
Oh, is this the one part of his thesis, or I think he has another paper on it as well, with the mathematics of the Sheikh.
This is here. This is from his Avicena on Graphs on Mathematical Concepts, right? He says something here which I think is just helpful. So he says, can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see it.
So he says, in the mind, mathematical objects can in principle be stripped of all special kinds of matter they are attached to in the physical world. Nonetheless, inasmuch as they are subject to mathematical studies, even in the mind, they should be considered as properties following upon matter. So in the mind, they are still associated with materiality, even though not with any specific kind of matter. Avicena explicitly mentions that if we do not consider number as a specific property of material things, if we consider it as an entity fully separate from matter, then it would not be receptive to any increase or decrease, and consequently cannot be subject to mathematical studies. In that case, it must be studied by metaphysics. Similarly, he argues that although we can detach geometrical shapes from all specific kinds of matter accompanying them in the physical world, they cannot be fully separate from materiality in general. Even in the mind, they cannot be perceived except as material entities. In sum, according to Avicena, mathematicians consider the object of their studies as entities that are separated from all determined kinds of matter, but still attached to materiality itself. And then he says here, so the dependency of geometrical objects on matter is much stronger than that of numbers. Geometrical objects are associated with matter, though not a specific kind of matter, even in definition. In contrast, numbers...
Yeah, well, that's true, right?
Yeah, in contrast, numbers can in principle be separate from matter. However, they can be studied by mathematics only when they are considered as being material accidents. Otherwise, they are subject to metaphysical studies. As I have argued elsewhere, by contrast with geometrical objects, which have an ontological dependence on materiality, numbers, inasmuch as they are objects of mathematics, have an epistemological dependency on matter.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'll definitely ponder upon this more.
Yeah.
The distinction has been made clear.
Okay, good. I'm glad about that. And also, Akhi, if you... Huh?
I'm saying forgive me, I feel like a lot of the time on lecture.
Oh, no worries. No, this is good. We're not on any specific time constraint. So as long as we get these things clear, that's important. So I think in light of this, if you think about it some more, and what you should do is, a project for you potentially is to try and take these distinctions and apply them to other branches of mathematics that you know.
Yeah.
You're in, I think, in a good position to do this. So you see what's said about like mathematics as such, the natures of its objects, the dependency relations, and then because other branches of mathematics have been developed, it would be good for somebody to apply these principles to clarify where the other branches stand in relation to mathematics, right? For example, are there going to be branches of mathematics that are fundamental alongside, let's say, arithmetic and geometry, and are there going to be branches that are not fundamental, that fall under one of the fundamental ones? So it would be good to to clarify this with regards to these new mathematical disciplines, these new species of mathematics that we might not know the place of in this scheme.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll definitely look into this.
It's a project. It's a project, right? Like, where would calculus fall here? I think you are in a good position to like clarify those things. I told Asan the same thing about doing something similar with medicine, right? And this will nicely contribute to the whole like aqsam al-ulum, the divisions of the sciences literature that the hukama are that they developed.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right, and I would love to just know that too. So I think it would be a benefit to lots of people, especially those interested in mathematics. Because I take it there's nothing like that out there right now, right? Like when you begin studying mathematics, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not given this divisions scheme of the entire branch, right? And where each branch sits in relation to the others. And how are they different from each other? How are they related? What their common objects are, and so on and so forth.
I already know that there are going to be some fields of mathematics. I think I was reading a little bit of Zarfur on this, and it makes sense to me. Like, take something like real analysis, right? Just the study of real numbers.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're probably familiar with the name Cantor.
Yeah.
Cantor wants to show that there are some sets of infinite objects that we intuitively would say that are larger than others, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he wanted to say that actually no, they're identical in size, right? So when you consider something like the set of even numbers, right, which would be a subset of the natural numbers, and then you consider the natural numbers. Well, the natural numbers is composed of the even and odd numbers, and the even obviously is the even numbers. But he decided to reject one of the axioms, right, that was actually held by Euclid, i.e., a whole is not identical to its part. And say that, look, I want to entertain and see what we think from this. And he had to actually dispense with this axiom in order to show this result. That I think the Sheikh would does not only accept metaphysically, but I think even mathematically. Right? So I think Zarfur makes this point too, right? That like it can't be the case that the even numbers, the set of even numbers, is what the mathematicians call equinumerous, right? It has the same cardinality, which just means the same number of elements as like the natural numbers. I mean, if you just think about it intuitively, that's basically saying that the whole is identical to its part in size, right?
Yeah.
And I think the Sheikh would not accept this even in mathematics, right? I think he thinks that this principle ought to be applied even in the higher sciences, like mathematics. Right? But we can discuss that later. I thought that's somewhere like that would be an interesting place to start to and see what the Sheikh would have to say about this more.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, send me that paper. I'm interested in reading it, and then we can talk about it some more, inshallah.
Inshallah, yeah, it's a paper where he talks about, I think, how it accepted mathematical physics as well.
Okay, yeah, I remember it vaguely, but I think I lost that paper. So if you have it, do send it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, but so anyway, think about sort of mapping out these various mathematical branches or sciences rather in light of this conceptual framework. Okay, so yeah, we spoke about that as well last class, and then we briefly touched on the status of logic in relation to hikmah, whether it's a science itself or merely an instrument of a science, and some of the opinions about that, and then also Sheikh Mudarris' opinion, which is that it's only an instrument. Okay. Now he moves on to his second introduction. You'll recall that he said that he wrote this treatise with two introductions. We went over the first, now it's the second. The second introduction is about the notion of a mafhum. What is a mafhum? And he's going to explain this notion with a view to making a division of the modalities. And one particular modality, as we'll see, will become relevant for everything that follows after, namely everything that he says about the categories, the Maqalat, because we will see that the categories will turn out to be all a division of one particular modality among the three that he's going to distinguish now. Okay? So, the mafhum that he begins with, he's going to give us, as I said, a division of it, but before that we need to briefly explain what it is. He himself doesn't do that. He just kind of assumes it. But it's important that we do that so we understand, the nature of the division of the mafhum that follow. As we said on a number of occasions, you have to first explain what a thing is before you get into its divisions. That's the proper order, right? Al-shayyu awwalan yu'arraf thumma tuqassam. That's the proper order to follow. Okay, so what is it to be a mafhum? So in the Islamic tradition, specifically according to the hukama, we have to understand mafhum in light of what idrak in general is. Okay? Idrak in general is basically to have the form of a thing obtained in the mind. That's idrak in general. That's what cognition is. It's the form of a thing that has obtained in the mind. Al-suratul hasilatu fid-dihn. Okay? Now, this form in the mind, depending on how it's considered, it can be called by various names, one of which is mafhum. Okay? We'll look at 6 terms that are used for this form in the mind, depending on various considerations. Okay? So, under one consideration, this form is called a ma'lum. On another consideration, it's called a ma'na. On a third consideration, it's called a mafhum, which is the term that's of interest to us here. On a fourth consideration, it's also called a mahiyya. Okay, so the form is a mahiyya. On a fifth consideration, it's called a haqiqa. And on a sixth consideration, it's also called a hawiyya. All these various terms are in reality one thing. They refer to one thing, yani, but in different respects, under different considerations, right? So let's look at each one briefly. The first one, as I said, is ma'lum, right? What's a ma'lum? What is the surah as a ma'lum? Basically, the surah that has obtained in the mind, okay? Insofar as you just consider it as having obtained in the mind and nothing else, i.e., without the consideration that the mind is somehow, attributed with that form or characterized by that form, under that consideration, the surah is called a ma'lum. Okay? So the surah in the mind, having obtained in the mind, without further consideration, that's just the surah as a ma'lum, as an object known. Okay? Or as a knowable, a thing known, an item known. Okay? Is that clear?
Yes, that's clear.
Okay. The second one that I mentioned is the surah as a ma'na. What is the surah as a ma'na? The surah as a ma'na is the surah insofar as it is intended, okay, by some expression, some verbal expression, some lafz. Okay? So insofar as the speaker intends it by some expression, some linguistic verbal expression, that surah is called a ma'na. It's a ma'na under that consideration. Okay? Namely, as referred to, if you like, by an expression, the surah is a ma'na. Okay? The third aspect, or third term, which is applied to the surah that has obtained in the mind, is, as I said, the term mafhum, which is the one that Sheikh Mudarris uses here. What is the surah as a mafhum? The surah, qua occurring in the mind by means of some expression, okay, is called a mafhum. Right? So unlike the surah as a ma'na, which is the surah as intended by some expression, as namely by the speaker, the surah as a mafhum is the surah insofar as it occurs in the mind by means of an expression. So if I use a word, say, if I say, human, and some surah comes to your mind because of hearing that expression by me, that is the surah as a mafhum, namely as something understood by means of an expression heard. Okay? The surah is called a mafhum under that consideration. Is that clear?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So, surah as a ma'lum, as a ma'na, as a mafhum. Then there's the surah as a mahiyya. That term is also used to characterize the surah. What's the surah as a mahiyya? Well, the surah as a mahiyya is the surah qua said in response to a what question or a what is it question. Okay, in that respect, the surah is called a mahiyya. Okay, the surah that has obtained in the mind, considered in response as something said in response to a what question, a what is it question about something, is called a mahiyya. Okay, so that's the fourth term. The fifth was surah as a haqiqah. What's a surah as a haqiqah? The surah as a haqiqah is the surah qua existing outside the mind. Qua existing outside the mind, it's called a haqiqah. So the term haqiqah is used to describe it in that respect, right? It's not really or usually or normally called a haqiqah insofar as you're just dealing with the surah as, as something, let's say, mental, something in the mind. It's the surah as it exists outside the mind. Okay, so haqiqah has this extramental connotation. And then finally, the sixth term is surah as a huwiyya. I don't know if you've come across this term, but huwiyya is a term that refers to the sort of individual identity of something. And so the surah, qua, something distinct from anything other than it, in other words, qua having an identity separate from others, is called a huwiyya. Okay? So 6 terms, all referring to the same thing under different considerations.
Could you say that huwiyya is like epseity or hayseity?
Epseity, I've seen, yeah. It's that's usually, I think, the term used to translate this technical term. Hayseity or hayacity, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but
yeah.
I've seen that too, although it's not as common, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can't say that epseity, right? Which means the specific identity of something, or the sort of its individual identity, as opposed to its specific identity, which is the identity of its species or something like that. Right? So, all these terms are used, right? And you'll find it helpful if you keep the consideration in mind in light of which those terms are used, you'll find this helpful when you're actually like coming across these terms in specific contexts in these texts, right? And it can help avoid confusion, right? But these are the senses in which these terms are used, right? The one that is of relevance to us, as I said, is the mafhum, which is the surah under what consideration? Insofar as it is, insofar as by means of some expression you understand some content, right? Right, so those are the 6 terms. Are they relatively clear? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Ajmal, you can listen to the audio after for the 6 terms that I just mentioned.
Yes, I don't think.
Yeah, inshallah.
Well, I'm taking notes as well, so I'll post them.
Oh, okay, that's, yeah, right, that's good. 1 second, let me... Okay, so having clarified these, now we can move on to their divisions. Or rather, having clarified, what a mafhum is, we can move on to the divisions of a mafhum, the divisions that Sheikh Mudarris makes here, right? Now he's going to make a 3-fold division of the mafhum. And the basis of this division is going to be the relation of a given mafhum, whatever it might be, to external or extramental existence, okay? So he's going to say, if you take any given mafhum, okay, and remember, a mafhum is a form that has obtained in the mind, okay. If you consider this form or this understood content in relation to external existence, that's going to give you 3 fundamental notions, and these are the notions of the modalities, right, as they apply to a given thing, okay? Okay, so the question then is, when is a given mafhum, okay, said to be one or other of these modalities, okay? He's going to say the following. If you take a given mafhum and you relate it to external existence, and you find that this mafhum cannot exist outside the mind in virtue of itself, in other words, its non-existence outside the mind is in virtue of itself, then that's what is called the impossible thing, i.e. the mafhum whose non-existence outside the mind is in virtue of itself. That's al-mumtani', he's going to say. That's the impossible thing, or the impossible item, or just the impossible, so that confusion doesn't arise. Okay? But if you consider the mafhum, and it's not like this, namely, it is such that its non-existence outside the mind is not in virtue of itself, or in other words, it is existent outside the mind, okay, then this comes into further divisions. Either its existence outside the mind is in virtue of itself, okay, just like how the mumtani was the mafhum whose non-existence outside the mind is in virtue of itself. This is a mafhum whose existence is outside the mind in virtue of itself. If it's like this, then it's called the necessary. Okay, this is that item is called the necessary thing. Okay. Finally, if it is a mafhum that exists outside the mind, however, its existence outside the mind is not in virtue of itself, that thing is going to be called the contingent, or al-mumkin al-khas, the specific contingent, to distinguish it from al-mumkin al-am, which we'll get into a bit later. But it's going to be called the contingent, okay? Or the possible, if you like, but contingent I think is better. Okay, this is the mafhum whose existence outside the mind is not in virtue of itself. Okay, so we have three divisions. We have the impossible, the necessary, and the contingent. Right, divisions that we get when we relate a given mafhum, a given understood content, a given, you could say, mahiya, or a given ma'na, when related to external existence. Either it's going to be such that the mafhum's non-existence is the mafhum is non-existent outside the mind in virtue of itself, in which case it's the impossible, or it's going to be mafhum about which it's true that that's not the case, i.e. it exists outside the mind. In that case, if its existence outside the mind is in virtue of itself, okay, then that's going to be called the necessary. Or its existence outside the mind is not in virtue of itself, i.e. it exists outside the mind, but it's in virtue of not itself, i.e. it's in virtue of something else. In that case, it's going to be called the contingent, or the special possible, al-mumkin al-khas. Okay, is that clear? I'm sure you guys are familiar with the modalities, right? Although, like, this is the modalities not in themselves, but as they're applied to a given mafhum, right? Makes sense? So
when you how meaning like not insofar that they are applied to essences.
Yani not. So we're not talking about like necessity, possibility, and impossibility in themselves. We're talking about a necessary thing or an impossible, quote unquote, thing, or a contingent thing, right? As they apply to a given mafhum, right? The two are related, but he's carrying out this, he's making this division with a view to the obtainment or the lack thereof of a mafhum outside the mind, right? It's a different consideration than just talking about, the modalities themselves, right? Necessity itself, contingency itself, and impossibility, but rather the necessary thing, or the contingent thing, right? The mafhum that exists outside the mind, which is described as necessary, as opposed to necessity itself, right? The wajib as opposed to wujub, the mumtani as opposed to imtina, and the mumkin as opposed to imkan. Okay, he does this because, when he goes on to talk about the categories and the things that fall under them, we're talking about objects, items, right? So it's more in keeping with the purposes of the treatise. Okay? So that's the threefold division of the mafhum into the necessary, the impossible, and the contingent with respect to the obtainment or non-obtainment of that mafhum outside the mind. So in sum, we could say the following. Look, the impossible is that which does not admit of existence, right? ما لا تقبل الوجود. The wajib, the necessary, is that which does not admit of non-existence, right? ما لا تقبل العدم. And the contingent is that which admits of existence and non-existence, right? We could briefly put it like that. Now, there's a potential issue here. Given the way that I've described the contingent, necessary, and impossible, following Sheikh Mudarris, there might be a potential misunderstanding, right? in the description of the impossible, Sheikh Mudarris said that the mafhum, okay, whose non-existence outside the mind is due to itself. Okay, that's the impossible. Now, this might suggest that, this mafhum of the impossible is some kind of a item which entails that it's non-existent outside the mind. Now, there's some kind of an entity, some kind of an essence, some kind of a quiddity that entails that it's non-existent outside the mind. It might suggest this, right? Given how he's characterized these notions. Similarly, the way he described the mafhum that is wajib, namely that whose existence outside the mind is due to itself or in virtue of itself, right? That might suggest again that you have here some item, okay, whose essence entails that it's existent outside the mind. Right? The language that he uses might indicate this to somebody, right? Because he uses an expression, or he uses a phrase which usually suggests a kind of like causal or explanatory relation, namely li, okay, which in grammar they call the lam of aliyah, the lam of explanation or causation, right? And which is usually rendered as due to itself or in virtue of itself. This due to might suggest that, this concept has some reality which entails that it's non-existent that it's non-existent outside the mind, or has some reality which entails that it must exist outside the mind. Right? And Shaykh Mudarris is going to clarify that this is false. One should not understand that expression this way. It's not, in other words, the lam of aliyah. It's not the lam of causation or explanation. Well, if it's not that, then what is it? How do we understand this idea of a notion whose non-existence or whose existence outside the mind is due to itself? Is due to itself. What do you mean due to itself? How is it due to itself if it's not in the way that one might imagine it is, the way that I just mentioned, right? Which is that its essence or its nature entails that it's existent or non-existent outside the mind in virtue of itself, i.e. in virtue of itself, i.e. or due to itself, i.e. due to its nature, due to its essence. So there's some essence here that entails that, right? If that's not what that expression means, what does it mean then? Is the issue clear?
Yeah, it's clear. It seems to me that one might fall into this kind of linguistic confusion, the way one might fall into the confusion that so when one says the cause for the non-existence of X is the non-existence of its cause, then they might reify the non-existence of its cause, right? But that's just to say that there's no cause, right? So it's something similar to that, right?
In this case?
Yeah, I'm saying the kind of...
Well, it's similar in that there's a potential confusion that is due to the language, right? One might potentially be misled by the language into thinking what I just mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Namely that the thing has an essence or the thing has a nature that explains its non-existence, or that entails it in the sense of entails its existence, in the sense of requires its existence, or its non-existence in the case of the mumtani'.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. That's kind of what I meant. For example, you say the mafhum was non-existent outside the mind in virtue of itself.
Yeah.
Right? That is called impossible. What we just really mean there is when you consider the mafhum, you come to know that this thing has no existence.
That's right.
That's in virtue of the meaning, right? It's not that there's the thing is out there and entails non-existence. That's the
Right.
conclusion that someone put there.
Right, exactly. And likewise the same for al-wajib, the mafhum that is
Yeah.
wajib, right? Although it's a bit trickier there because some people, interestingly, did take this position. This is why it's a bit trickier. Some people were, I think, confused and really did take the position that the wajib, okay, is an entity whose essence entails its existence. Just like how, a triangle is an essence that entails certain features. It's just like that, right? Now that's a problem, but they did take this sort of view. So about the wajib, they held this kind of view. About the mumtani, it's easier to see why that can't be the case. But about the wajib, it's not as easy. This is why some people took this position, right? But
Yeah.
Sheikh Mudarris is going to say
Mhm.
that's a wrong construal of both notions.
I see.
Right.
So for the necessary, you would want to say something like, instead of saying that it's some item out there that entails existence, rather we should think about it as out there is just existence, not some item that entails existence.
Well, he's not going to say that because that is that takes a position on the nature of this item out there, right? Which is a metaphysical consideration, right? Even though that's true, he's not going to say that. He's going to explain rather what the due to itself locution really means. Okay, and it's related to, it's close to actually what you said earlier about the impossible. Okay, so what does he say? What does he say to prevent this potential misunderstanding? He says, when we say that the mafhum exists out there or doesn't exist out there in virtue of itself, due to itself, what that means is that, so for example, in the case of the mumtani', the impossible, what that means is that when we consider the impossible, okay, when we consider, in other words, the thing whose when we consider the mafhum whose non-existence outside the mind is due to itself, when we consider that mafhum, okay, that consideration necessitates a judgment that an instance of that mafhum is impossible of existence. That's what it means. In virtue of itself, due to itself, يعني, when you consider the mafhum itself, that consideration leads you to a judgment, necessitates a judgment, okay, that an instance of that mafhum cannot be. In other words, an instance of that mafhum is impossible when you consider that kind of mafhum. So, an example. He says, take the mafhum of nothing. Okay? Take the concept of nothing. If you consider that concept, what that concept involves, you will see that, in other words, you will affirm as true that concept cannot have an instance. In other words, there can't be something that is nothing, right? Because that's just a contradiction. Okay? So, considering the mafhum itself, whatever that mafhum is, okay, necessitates a hukm on your part, okay? And this hukm is not like, it's you're forced into this hukm, okay? It's not just like an arbitrary judgment that you make. You're forced into this hukm by that consideration, okay? That this mafhum cannot have an instance. And the same thing for the mafhum of wajib. It's a mafhum which, when you consider it, it necessitates the judgment that the instance of this mafhum, should it have one, will be something that must exist. Okay, so the in virtue of itself or due to itself expression is about the i'tibar of the mafhum itself leading you to make a certain judgment about the instances of that mafhum. In the one case, that an instance for that mafhum is impossible, it cannot have an instance. In the other case, that the instance must be necessary of existence. Okay, its instance must be necessary. Its instance, has to be the sort of thing that cannot fail to exist, right? It's the objective consideration of the mafhum itself necessitates that judgment. That's what it means, the due to itself locution. Not there's something here that entails its non-existence, or there's something here that entails its existence. It's rather the consideration of the judgment entails the consideration of the mafhum entails a certain judgment on your part, namely that an instance is impossible for this mafhum, or an instance is necessary of existence for this mafhum. Okay? Right, the consideration of the mafhum itself, yani without bringing anything extraneous to that mafhum, okay, leads to you to make that judgment. Right? So when you consider the concept of nothing, or when you consider the concept of, let's say, the PNC, okay, it leads you to the judgment that these things cannot have an instance. It's impossible. Right? And likewise for the mafhum of al-wajib. Does that make sense? Is that clear?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right? Okay, so let's get to the text then, having explained that. Any questions about that?
Yeah, Dawla Salam.
Assalamu alaikum. Befahmu.
I'm so sorry, apologies. I just got stuck with this meeting. And
No, don't worry about it.
They said 10 minutes and it took me literally 50 minutes. So, yeah, and I missed basically everything. So,
don't worry. You'll listen to the recording. Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing that came into my mind, and you already shed good light upon it, is the word itself, mafhum.
Yeah.
Does it involve that it's more like a mental sort of existence rather than like something that is mawjood outside?
No, not necessarily. So, the part you missed, I clarified this.
Yeah,
but when you get a chance to listen to it, inshallah, maybe it'll clarify it for you. So, but briefly, in the technical terminology of the ulama, when they describe something as a mafhum, okay, they are describing it. Okay, hold on. Let me backtrack.
Yeah,
so no, that's okay. So, mafhum for them is a term used to describe the surah that's in the mind, okay, the form that's in the mind, with the following qaid, condition, namely, insofar as, okay, that surah in the mind is in the mind because of the person having heard an expression used to express it. Okay, so if I say, for example, human, and you hear that word, okay, and a certain form or ma'na comes to your mind when you hear me say that word, that ma'na that's now in your mind, or that surah that's now in your mind because of having heard this expression, it's called a mafhum under that itibar. Okay, so the mafhum is the surah or the ma'na insofar as it comes to your mind after hearing it designated by some expression.
Yes.
Okay? So it's not about whether it is not a part of its definition that it be mental or non-mental. It's what's part of its it's not part of its itibar that it be mental or non-mental. It's what is a part of it is that it occurs by means of an expression heard. Okay? Then that's the thing now in the mind it's called a mafhum under that aspect. That same thing is called a surah or a ma'lum or a ma'no, but under different considerations. But it's the same thing. Okay? So you have this thing in the mind, and depending on how you view it, you call it different names. You call it the name mafhum when you view it as having obtained in your mind because of some expression that was heard. Okay?
Idrak is primal and then mafhum is after.
Yeah, so you have an idrak of something, right? And idrak is to have a surah in your mind. That's what idrak is. Now this surah, if it came to your mind because you heard me say a word, and hearing is a kind of idrak, right? You had idrak because you heard me say a word and a meaning came to your mind. That meaning, insofar as it came to your mind because of you hearing a word that expressed it, it's called a mafhum in that respect. Okay? So there's no it being mental or non-mental as a part of the consideration of what it is here. Okay? Even if it turns out to be mental, which is fine, but that's not what is considered in its definition as a mafhum. Right? Now, this mafhum, when you relate it to external existence, wujud khariji, either it'll be impossible, necessary, or contingent, depending on how it's related, right? As he just mentioned. I hope that's helpful.
Yes.
Okay. So, قال الشيخ مدرس رحمه الله المقدمة الثانية المفهوم. So the مفهوم. إن كان عدمه يعني عدم المفهوم في الخارج لذاته فممتنع. If the mafhum's non-existence in outside the mind is due to itself, okay, then it is the impossible. What's an example of that? كلا شيء, like nothing, he says. يعني the mafhum of nothing. Okay? The mafhum of nothing. Something whose non-existence outside the mind is impossible. You can't have nothing outside the mind. Right? You can't point at something and say, oh, that's an example of nothing. Right? Or like جمع النقيضين ورفعهما, or like the principle of non-contradiction. Right? You can't have a case of something that combines contradictories or that separates them.
So it's in this sense that you cognize the surah of a squared circle. You cognize its mafhum.
Naam, exactly.
And then you it basically necessitates that the judgment that's impossible.
Exactly. It's not that there's some essence of being a squared circle that entails that it's impossible of existence outside the mind. It's that when you think about that mafhum objectively, that mafhum itself, that consideration leads you to make a judgment that there can't be any instances of such a concept. Right? Okay. Okay, so that's the mumtani', right? وإلا, otherwise, or if not, i.e., if its adam is not lidatihi on one reading, okay, or if the mafhum's adam is not lidatihi in the sense that it is existent or it has wujud, i.e. outside the mind, okay, in other words, it's not a non-existent, it's something that exists, then either it's going to be wajib or mumkin khas, right? So wa illa can be read in two ways. It can be read as saying if not, i.e. if it's if its non-existence is not due to itself, i.e. it's due to another, or if it is not non-existent outside the mind due to itself, i.e. if it does exist outside the mind. Okay? And I think Shaykh Mudarris leans toward the second reading, i.e. wa illa means if it's not non-existent outside the mind, i.e. it is existent outside the mind, then إن كان وجوده فيه لذاته فواجب. If it is existent outside the mind, but its existence in it, i.e. outside the mind, في الخارج, is due to itself, then it is necessary. It is the necessary. Okay, and then he gives an example of that. وهو يعني the thing whose existence outside the mind is due to itself. وهو الله تعالى, and that is God the Exalted. Because it will turn out, as we learn in theology, that there can only be one such item, i.e. whose existence outside the mind is due to itself. Okay? وإلا, otherwise, i.e. if its wujud in the kharij, outside the mind, is not due to itself, i.e. it is due to something else, then فهو ممكن خاص, then it is the specific contingent or the special contingent. It is the special possible, yani the contingent. Okay? The contingent, in other words, is the thing that exists outside the mind, but its existence is not due to itself. Right? And that can be a non-existent contingent. Okay? Kil anqa, like the phoenix, he gives an example of that. Okay? Which is a mumkin, khas, ma'duman, kil anqa. Or it could be a existent contingent. Right? Like what? Like a jawhar or an arad. Okay? So the jawhar, he says jawharan wa aradan, this only pertains to the mumkin khas, that is mawjudun, that is an existent. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. So, and with that, he finishes the second introduction, and I think that's a good place to stop. And next session, inshallah, we'll get into his first maqala. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.